I got married and moved in with my husband, believing I was starting a new life. I didn't know that in this house, my role had already been decided. I realized I was holding my breath in someone else's kitchen, staring at a refrigerator that wasn't mine, listening to a house breathe around me, like it had never been waiting for me. The first morning after I moved in, the floor was cold under my feet, and the coffee already smelled burnt, not fresh, not new, like a routine that had started long before I arrived and had no intention of changing. I stood there in an oversized shirt, unsure where the mugs were, unsure if I was allowed to open the wrong cabinet, already feeling like I was interrupting something private. His mother's voice came from the hallway, calm and certain, telling him how much sugar he should use, because that's how he always liked it. And he answered her without hesitation, without even looking at me. I told myself it was nothing, just the awkwardness of the first days, the normal friction of moving into a space that held years of memories that weren't mine. I had given up my apartment, my routines, my quiet, packed my life into boxes, labeled with black marker, and promises, and crossed state lines convinced I was building something new with the man I loved. I thought love meant creating a shared center, a place where we would slowly learn each other's habits and adjust. I didn't realize I was stepping into a structure that was already finished. His name was Daniel, and his mother was Margaret, and their conversations flowed like a language I had never learned. They spoke in shorthand and raised eyebrows in half sentences, in sighs that carried history. When I tried to join in, the rhythm broke for a second, just long enough for me to notice, then resumed without me. I would add a comment, suggest a different plan, and it would hang there unanswered, until Margaret gently redirected the topic back to what she and Daniel had already decided. The house itself seemed to agree with her. Her photos lined the walls, her furniture filled the rooms, her rules shaped the air. Shoes by the door exactly where she wanted them, towels folded a certain way, dinner at the same hour every night. I asked Daniel once if we could rearrange the bedroom, maybe move the dresser closer to the window, and he hesitated, then said it might upset his mother, because she liked knowing where things were. He said it lightly, like a joke, but the answer landed heavy in my chest. I started shrinking without realizing it. I spoke less at dinner, learned to wait before entering a room, adjusted my tone so it wouldn't sound like disagreement. When Margaret corrected me, it was always subtle, wrapped in politeness, framed as help. She showed me how Daniel preferred his shirts folded, how he liked his meals seasoned, how he got stressed if things weren't done a certain way. She spoke about him like he was still a child, and he let her, smiling, nodding, grateful. At night, when we were alone, I tried to explain the unease that followed me through the house like a shadow. Daniel would listen for a moment, then say I was overthinking, that his mother meant well, that this was just temporary, until we found our own place. He said we were lucky to have her help, lucky to save money, lucky to be together. I wanted to believe him, so I swallowed my discomfort and told myself patience was a form of love. But patience slowly turned into silence. The first real argument happened over something small, something almost stupid. I bought new curtains for the living room, light ones, simple, trying to soften the space, to leave some trace of myself. Margaret noticed them immediately, her lips tightening just enough to register. And later that evening, she told Daniel they blocked too much light, that the old ones were better for the room. He agreed with her before I could explain why I chose them, before I could say I wanted the house to feel like ours too. I laughed it off in front of them, but later in the bathroom I stared at my reflection and felt a strange shame, like I had overstepped without realizing the boundary. I took the curtains down the next morning. No one asked me to. No one thanked me either. From that moment on, I started noticing patterns I couldn't unsee. Any disagreement, no matter how minor, found Daniel standing beside his mother, his body angled toward her, his voice aligning with hers. When I questioned it, he accused me of creating tension, of making him choose when there was nothing to choose. He said family came first, like it was a rule so obvious it didn't need explaining. I began to feel like a guest who had stayed too long, like someone whose presence needed constant justification. Margaret would ask where I was going when I left the house, when I would be back, what I planned to cook. It sounded caring, but it felt like supervision. Daniel saw nothing wrong with it. He said she worried. He said I should be grateful. The turning point came quietly, on a rainy afternoon when the house smelled of soup and old wood. I had just come back from a job interview, nervous and hopeful, and wanted to talk about it, to feel supported. Before I could finish my first sentence, Margaret interrupted to say that the commute sounded impractical, that the hours would interfere with dinner, that Daniel needed stability at home. Daniel nodded, thoughtful, and said maybe it wasn't the right time for me to focus on work. Something inside me went still. I realized in that moment that my life was being edited without my consent, my choices filtered through someone else's comfort. I wasn't a partner in this household. I was an accessory, expected to fit neatly into a space designed by someone else. When I tried to protest, my voice shook, and Daniel looked at me like I was being unreasonable, like I was disrupting the peace. That night, lying beside him in the dark, I felt lonelier than I ever had alone. His breathing was steady, familiar, while my mind replayed every small surrender I had made since moving in. I wondered when exactly I had stopped being myself and started becoming convenient. I wondered how many parts of me I would have to give up to keep this marriage intact. The next morning I woke early and stood by the window, watching the street come alive. Cars passing, people moving freely toward lives that felt impossibly distant. Margaret was already awake, moving through the kitchen with purpose, and Daniel joined her, their voices blending into the soundtrack of a home that was never meant to be mine. I understood then that this wasn't a phase, or a misunderstanding, or a problem that time would solve. It was a system, and I was the extra piece that didn't quite fit. I stayed quiet that day, packing away my thoughts like fragile objects I didn't yet know how to handle. I smiled when expected, answered politely, played my role. But inside, something had shifted. Something irreversible. I had crossed a line not when I moved in, but when I finally saw the truth of where I stood. And once you see that, it's impossible to pretend you don't. The rain started again in the evening, tapping against the windows, and as Margaret discussed weekend plans with Daniel, including me only as an afterthought, I felt a clarity settle over me. Calm and terrifying at the same time. I didn't know yet what I would do, or how I would leave, or what it would cost me. I only knew that staying would mean disappearing completely. I thought clarity would bring relief, but instead it sharpened everything, like suddenly seeing cracks in a wall you had been leaning on. The next days unfolded slowly, painfully ordinary, and that was the worst part. Nothing dramatic happened at first. No shouting, no slammed doors, just the steady confirmation that I did not exist in this house as an equal. Margaret began involving Daniel in everything that concerned me, but never involving me directly. If dinner was late, she told him. If I left dishes in the sink, she mentioned it to him later, quietly, privately, like a report. He would then come to me with that careful tone, one meant to sound neutral, explaining what I should do differently next time. Each time it happened, a small part of me recoiled, not because of the criticism itself but because of the process. I was being managed, not spoken to. I tried to change tactics. I started addressing things immediately, calmly, asking Margaret directly if something bothered her. She smiled every time, assured me everything was fine, that I was imagining tension, that she was just happy to have me there. Then later, Daniel would repeat the same concerns, almost word for word, as if they had appeared in his mind independently. When I pointed out the pattern, he frowned, said I was making accusations, said I was putting him in the middle. But he was already in the middle. He had just chosen his side a long time ago. One evening, we sat at the dining table, the three of us, eating in silence. The clinking of cutlery sounded too loud. I mentioned that I was thinking of visiting my sister the following weekend, needing some space, a break. Margaret paused, looked at Daniel, and asked him if that was a good idea, given how busy things were at home. He hesitated, then said maybe I should go another time, when things were more settled. I felt heat rise to my face, a mix of anger and humiliation. I asked him, directly this time, why he needed his mother's approval for my plans. The room went still. Margaret leaned back slightly, wounded, and Daniel's expression hardened. He said I was being disrespectful, that I didn't understand family dynamics, that I was forcing him to choose again. That word, choose, echoed in my head long after the conversation ended. That night, we argued quietly in the bedroom, voices low so they wouldn't carry. I told him I felt erased, like I didn't matter in my own marriage. He listened, arms crossed, then said something that changed the way I saw him forever. He said his mother had always been there for him, that she had sacrificed everything, that I was new, and trust took time. He said if I couldn't accept that, maybe I wasn't ready for this family. Family, not marriage. I lay awake until morning, staring at the ceiling, replaying his words, until they lost all ambiguity. I wasn't building a future with him. I was being tested, measured against a standard set by someone else. And I was failing, not because I was wrong, but because I refused to disappear quietly. The pressure intensified after that. Margaret became colder, more formal, her politeness edged with something sharp. She stopped asking how my day was, stopped including me even superficially. Daniel became distant too, defensive, treating every conversation like a potential attack. I learned to read his moods, to predict when it was safer to stay silent, when a comment might be interpreted as criticism. I hated how quickly I adapted. The real fracture happened over something I couldn't ignore. I found an email on Daniel's laptop one afternoon while he was in the shower, a message from Margaret sent earlier that day. She had written that I was unstable, that I was trying to come between them, that she was worried about his future with me. She suggested counseling, not for us, but for him, to help him see things clearly. My hands trembled as I closed the laptop. When I confronted him later, he didn't deny it. He said she was concerned, that she only wanted what was best for him. I asked him why he hadn't defended me, why he hadn't told her to talk to me directly. He looked tired, almost annoyed, and said he didn't want to upset her, that she was older, that I should be more understanding. In that moment, something broke cleanly inside me. I stopped arguing after that. Not because things were resolved, but because I understood the futility of it. Any resistance only strengthened their bond, confirmed their narrative. I began making plans quietly, researching apartments, calculating savings, imagining a version of myself who didn't flinch at the sound of footsteps in the hallway. Margaret noticed my withdrawal and mistook it for submission. Daniel relaxed, believing the conflict had passed. They laughed more, talked freely, while I moved through the house like a ghost, already halfway gone. It was strange how peaceful things became once I stopped trying to belong. The final conversation came on a Sunday morning, sunlight spilling across the kitchen table. Margaret was discussing holiday plans, assuming my presence months in advance, outlining where we would go, what I would do. I interrupted her, politely, and said I wouldn't be there. Both of them looked at me, surprised. I told Daniel I was leaving, not dramatically, not angrily, just stating a fact. I said I couldn't live in a marriage where my voice needed permission. He stared at me, stunned, then angry, accusing me of giving up, of tearing the family apart. Margaret said nothing, only watched, her expression unreadable. I packed my things that afternoon, every box lighter than the last. When I walked out of the house, no one followed me. The door closed softly behind me, and for the first time in months, I could breathe without feeling watched. I didn't know what would come next, how I would rebuild, or who I would be after this. I only knew that I was no longer willing to be the third person in my own marriage.